The engine noise was wrong. That's what pulled me out of the half-sleep you get into when you've been sitting in a muddy ditch for 12 hours. It was July 1944, somewhere in the Bocage country near St. Lo, Normandy. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth, cow manure from the nearby fields, and the lingering, acrid scent of cordite from the morning's artillery barrage. The noise wasn't the high-pitched whine of a Messerschmitt fighter, the kind that made your stomach drop because you knew strafing fire was seconds away. This was different. It was a low, stuttering drone, like a lawnmower fighting tall grass. I shifted my weight, the mud sucking at my boots. My M1 Garand was resting across my knees, the walnut stalk slick with humidity and the sweat off my palms. I wiped a hand across my face, smearing dirt into my 3-day stubble, and looked up through the canopy of the hedgerow. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, dotted with puffy summer clouds that looked too innocent for a war zone. "You hear that, Sully?" It was Private Eddie Beatrice, crouched next to me. Eddie was a kid from Brooklyn, 19 years old, with eyes that always seemed too big for his face. He was a good kid, but nervous. He fidgeted constantly, tapping his helmet strap, checking his ammo pouch every 5 minutes. "Yeah, Eddie, I hear it." I kept my voice low. Sound carried in these sunken lanes. The drone got louder, closer. Then I saw it. It drifted over the tree line to our east, flying impossibly slow. It was gangly and awkward-looking, with high wings and landing gear that hung down like skeletal legs. A Fieseler Storch, a German spotter plane. It was putting along at maybe 90 miles an hour, banking lazily over the patchwork fields. It looked harmless. It wasn't dropping bombs, it wasn't firing cannons, it was just watching. And that's what made my blood run cold. Our platoon sergeant, Pop Miller, was further down the line. Pop was an old-timer, maybe 35, which made him ancient to us. He'd been in North Africa and Sicily. He'd seen it all, and his default expression was a weary scowl. He looked up at the plane and just shook his head. "Keep your heads down," Miller hissed down the line. "Don't move. Don't so much as twitch." The training manuals back in the States, the ones we memorized at Fort Benning until we could recite them in our sleep, they were crystal clear on this scenario. Ignore observation aircraft. Do not reveal your position by engaging non-combatant aircraft. Save ammunition for hostile fighters or ground targets. The logic was sound, on paper. If you shoot at the spotter, you tell the enemy exactly where you are. If you miss, you've just rung the dinner bell for every mortar team in a 5-mile radius. So we sat there, frozen, like statues covered in olive drab and mud. The Storch circled. It was low, maybe 500 feet. I could clearly see the black Balkenkreuz, crosses on the wings and fuselage. I could see the greenhouse-style cockpit glass glistening in the sun. I grew up in central Illinois, near the river bottoms. My old man put a shotgun in my hands before I could ride a bike. We hunted ducks in the fall, in the freezing marshes. The thing about duck hunting, the thing my dad drilled into me, isn't just being a good shot. It's about patience. It's about reading the wind and understanding how to lead a target that's moving across your vision. You don't aim where the bird is, you aim where it's going to be when the shot gets there. It's a feeling in your gut more than a calculation in your head. Watching that Storch bank slowly over the hedgerow, it didn't look like a warplane to me. It looked like a big, slow, canvas-backed duck looking for a place to land. "He's turning back," Corporal Jenkins whispered from the other side of Beatrice. Jenkins was the unit cynic. If headquarters sent down an order to wear extra socks, Jenkins would argue it was a conspiracy to slow us down. He saw something. I bet he saw the tanks parked behind the barn. "Shut up, Jenkins," Miller growled. The plane was completing a lazy figure 8, coming back around toward our position. The manual said, "Let it go." Pop Miller said, "Let it go." But my gut was screaming something else entirely. That little plane wasn't harmless. It was the eyes of the German artillery. It was up there painting a target on us. Every second it stayed in the air, the calculations were getting more precise on the other side of the lines. I looked at the plane. I looked at Eddie Beatrice, chewing his thumbnail until it bled. I thought about the 88s. The German 80mm artillery pieces were terrifying weapons. Their shells came in faster than the speed of sound. You didn't hear the whistle until after the explosion had already torn the world apart. If that spotter pilot was radioing our coordinates, we wouldn't even hear it coming. The plane was almost broadside to me now, steadying its course. The pilot was slow, methodical, arrogant. He felt safe up there, thinking we were too disciplined or too scared to take a pop at him. My hands moved before my brain fully signed off on the decision. I brought the Garand up to my shoulder. The familiar weight was comforting. I rested my left elbow on the lip of the ditch for stability. "Sully, what the hell are you doing?" Eddie whispered, panic in his voice. "Frank, stand down!" Miller barked, seeing my movement. I ignored them. I tuned everything out. The smell of the mud, the heat, the voices. My world narrowed down to the rear peep sight and the front sight post. I tracked the Storch. It was moving left to right. I swung the rifle barrel ahead of the propeller hub, giving it what felt like the right amount of lead for that distance and speed. It was instinct born on frosty Illinois mornings. I took a breath, held it at the halfway point. My finger tightened on the trigger. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The shot broke the heavy silence of the afternoon with a sharp crack. The Garand kicked against my shoulder. I didn't wait to see the result. I reacquired the sight picture, accounted for the recoil, and squeezed again. Crack, and a third time. Crack. The first shot must have missed clean, but the second or third? I saw it. A sudden puff of dirty gray smoke trailed from the engine cowling of the Storch. The smooth drone of the engine turned into a ragged coughing sound. The plane shuddered violently in the air, like a bird hit mid-flight. "Son of a bitch," Jenkins breathed. The Storch dipped its left wing sharply. It wasn't a controlled turn anymore. It was a fall. The engine cut out completely, leaving a sudden, shocking silence that was immediately filled by the sound of wind rushing over the plane's surfaces as it descended rapidly. It glided heavily, losing altitude fast, heading toward a thick line of trees about a half-mile away. We watched it clip the tops of the tall oaks, tearing off branches, and then it disappeared behind the green wall of the hedgerow. A second later, the sound reached us. Not a fiery explosion like in the newsreels. Just a sickening, heavy crunch of wood, canvas, and metal smashing into the earth. Then silence again. For a moment, nobody moved. We were all just staring at the spot where the plane had vanished. Pop Miller crawled over to me. His face was inches from mine. He was furious, his eyes narrow slits. "I told you to hold your fire, Sullivan. You disobeyed a direct order. You trying to get us all killed?" I looked him in the eye. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer. "He was marking us, Pop. I know he was." Miller held my gaze for a second, then spat into the mud. The anger drained out of his face, replaced by the usual weary pragmatism. "Well, you hit the bastard, I'll give you that. That was some shooting." He stood up, crouching low below the hedgerow line. "All right, listen up. Jenkins, Beatrice, Sullivan, on me. We're going to check the crash site. The rest of you hold this position, eyes open. If that pilot got a radio call off before he went down, we might have company soon." We grabbed our gear and scrambled out of the ditch. Moving through the bocage was nightmare work. The hedgerows were centuries old, thick earthen walls tangled with roots, briars, and dense brush that you couldn't just walk through. You had to hack your way through or find a gate, and gates were usually pre-sighted by German machine guns. We moved in a tactical column, staying low, moving fast from cover to cover. The adrenaline was pumping now, washing away the fatigue. We crossed a sunken road, the mud halfway up our shins, and cut through an apple orchard. The air smelled sweeter here, of ripening fruit, but it was mixed with that ever-present undertone of death that hung over Normandy that summer. Dead cattle bloating in the fields, the shallow graves of soldiers from both sides. We got to the hedgerow where the plane had gone down. We could see smoke rising now, thin wisps of it. Not a raging fire, which was lucky. We pushed through a gap in the thorns, Jenkins cursing softly as the briars snagged his uniform. The crash site was a small field enclosed by stone walls. The Storch was a wreck. It had plowed into the far wall. The left wing was sheared clean off, lying 50 feet away. The fuselage was crumpled inward, the tail section twisted at a sharp angle. The propeller was bent backward like banana peels. The smell was overwhelming now, the sharp chemical sting of high-octane aviation fuel leaking onto the soil. "Watch the fuel," Miller warned, his M1 carbine raised, scanning the tree line. "One spark and this whole field goes up." We approached the cockpit slowly, weapons trained on the wreckage. The plexiglass canopy was shattered. "Over here," Eddie whispered, pointing to the side of the stone wall. The pilot was there. He had managed to crawl out of the wreckage before collapsing. He was sitting on the ground, his back against the stones, his legs splayed out in front of him. He was wearing a brown leather flight jacket over a blue-gray uniform. His flight helmet was off, lying on the grass next to him. He was young, shockingly young. He couldn't have been older than 20, maybe younger than Eddie. He had blonde hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Blood was trickling from a nasty gash above his left eye, running down his cheek. He was clutching his left arm close to his chest. It was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle. We fanned out around him in a semicircle, rifles leveled at his chest. He looked up at us. He didn't try to reach for the holster at his belt. He didn't look defiant. He just looked dazed, in pain, and incredibly tired. His eyes were blue, and they were wide with the realization of his situation. It's a strange moment when you finally see the enemy up close, not as a gray shape at 300 yards, but as a person. All the propaganda, all the hate you build up to be able to pull the trigger, it hits a wall when you're looking at a kid bleeding in the grass. He wasn't a monster. He was just a busted-up pilot who had run out of luck. Miller stepped forward, kicked the pilot's Luger pistol away from his reach, and then patted him down for other weapons. The pilot flinched when Miller touched his broken arm, letting out a sharp gasp, but he didn't resist. "Jenkins, watch the perimeter," Miller ordered. "Beatrice, keep your rifle on him. Sully, check the cockpit for intel. Maps, codebooks, anything." I slung my Garand over my shoulder and moved to the wreckage of the fuselage. I had to be careful. Fuel was dripping steadily from a ruptured tank somewhere behind the seat. The cockpit was tiny, a mess of broken glass, twisted metal controls, and wires. I leaned in, the fumes making my eyes water. I checked the side pockets of the doors. Nothing. I looked under the pilot's seat. There was something jammed back there. I reached in and tugged. It was a leather satchel, tan-colored with a brass clasp. It looked expensive, something an officer would carry. I pulled it free and stepped back from the plane, away from the fuel fumes. I undid the clasp and opened the main flap. Inside there were papers, a couple of mechanical pencils, and a slide rule. I pulled out the papers. They were maps. Not just standard-issue topographical maps, but large-scale aerial reconnaissance photographs. They were overlaid with sheets of transparent acetate. I unfolded the top one. My heart stopped in my chest. It was a photograph of the area we were currently standing in, taken from high altitude maybe a day or two ago. It was incredibly detailed. You could see individual trees, the stone walls, the roofs of farmhouses. But it was the markings on the acetate that made my blood run cold. They were made with red and blue grease pencils. There were circles, crosses, lines indicating fields of fire. I recognized the crossroads half a mile back where C Company was dug in. There was a neat red circle around it, with notes scribbled next to it in German script. I saw the large L-shaped barn where battalion headquarters had set up shop yesterday. Another red circle. Then my finger traced down to our sector, the sunken lane we had just been hiding in. It was marked with terrifying precision. A series of small red crosses marked our foxholes along the ditch. There were symbols indicating where they thought our light machine gun was positioned, and they were exactly right. Next to the line of foxholes, in neat, precise numbers, were artillery coordinates. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I felt sick. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. That boy sitting against the wall, that kid with the broken arm and the dazed eyes, he hadn't just been out for a Sunday drive. He had been up there verifying these positions. He was the final check before the fire mission was called in. If I hadn't taken that shot, if I had listened to the manual and Pop Miller and let him fly away, within an hour, maybe less, the German artillery would have rained hell down on those exact red marks. They wouldn't have been guessing. They would have been bracketing us with mathematical certainty. Beatrice, Jenkins, Pop, me, we'd all be dead, torn apart in that muddy ditch without ever knowing why the fire was so accurate. "Sully, what you got?" Pop Miller called out, still standing over the prisoner. I walked over to him, wordlessly handing him the map. I pointed to the markings around our position. Pop stared at the map. His jaw tightened. The color drained out of his face beneath the grime. He looked from the map to the pilot, then back to the map. He traced the red lines with a dirty fingernail. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. It was a prayer, not a curse. He looked down at the German pilot with a new expression. It wasn't pity anymore. It was a chilling realization of how professional this war really was. The pilot looked back at us, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He knew what we had found. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "Jenkins! Beatrice!" Miller's voice was low and urgent. "Get over here and look at this." They came over, keeping their weapons trained on the German. They looked at the map over Miller's shoulder. "Holy Mother," Eddie breathed. "That's us. That's right where we were sitting." Jenkins, the cynic, didn't say anything smart for once. He just stared at the red crosses that marked his own potential grave. "He had us cold," he said quietly. Another 10 minutes and he'd have radioed the final correction. The silence in that field was heavy. We were standing there, 4 Americans, looking at the proof of our near-death experience, and looking at the agent of that intended death sitting at our feet. A wave of anger washed over me. It was a hot, blinding rage. This kid, floating around up there in the blue sky, detached from the mud and the blood, calmly marking X's on a map that would turn living men into meat. It felt clinical. It felt cruel. I looked at the pilot. I think he saw the look in my eyes because he flinched, pressing himself harder against the stone wall. "You little bastard," I whispered. Pop Miller put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, restraining. "Easy, Sully. He's a POW now. He's out of the war. He was going to kill us all, Pop. He had it all laid out." "But he didn't," Miller said firmly, "because you stopped him. You trusted your gut and you stopped him. That's what matters." He was right, of course, but the adrenaline was still crashing through my system, mixing with the relief and the terror of what I was seeing on that map. "We need to get this back to HQ," Miller said, taking charge again. "Now, this intel is hot. Beatrice, you and Jenkins patch up the prisoner's arm as best you can. Use his own field dressing. Sully, you're on point. Let's move." While Eddie and Jenkins awkwardly splinted the pilot's arm with a piece of wood from the wreckage and a bandage, an act of mercy that seemed surreal given what we had just learned, I folded the maps carefully and put them back in the satchel. I slung the satchel over my shoulder. It felt heavier now. It felt like I was carrying the weight of the whole battalion's survival. We marched the prisoner back the way we came. He walked stumbling, gritting his teeth against the pain in his arm, but he didn't complain. I walked ahead, scanning the hedgerows with a new intensity. The world felt different now. Before, the war had felt like chaos to me, just noise and confusion and sudden random violence. But after seeing that map, I realized it wasn't random at all. It was all a giant, lethal chessboard. We were just small pieces being moved around, and someone high up on the other side was calculating exactly how to remove us from the board. It made me feel smaller, more vulnerable, but it also made me smarter. I knew now that nothing the enemy did was without purpose. There were no harmless actions. We got back to our lines without incident. When we reached the battalion CP, located in that big L-shaped barn I'd seen circled on the map, things happened fast. Pop Miller demanded to see the S2, the intelligence officer. A young captain came out, looking annoyed at the interruption, until Miller laid the satchel on the table and opened it. I watched the captain's face as he unfolded that first map with the overlays. His annoyance vanished instantly, replaced by pale shock. He didn't say a word to us. He just grabbed the field telephone and started cranking it frantically. "Get me regiment, now! Priority flash!" He waited a second, tapping his fingers nervously on the map. "Colonel, this is Captain Evans at 2nd Battalion. Sir, we need to shift positions immediately." "Yes, sir, all companies. We have captured enemy intelligence." "Yes, sir." "They have us bracketed. They know exactly where we are." "Yes, sir. We need to move now." He hung up and started barking orders to his staff. Runners were dispatched to C Company and the mortar platoon. The whole area burst into frantic activity. The captain finally looked up at us. "Where did you get these?" "Sergeant Sullivan shot down a spotter plane, sir," Miller said, jerking a thumb at me. "We pulled these off the pilot." The captain looked at me. He looked tired like everyone else, but there was a new respect in his eyes. "Good work, Sergeant. You have no idea how good. You just saved a hell of a lot of lives today." "What about the prisoner, sir?" Miller asked. "Have the medics take a look at him, then send him back to Division MPs for interrogation. If he had these maps, he knows things." We walked back to our platoon's position. The order to move out came down 10 minutes later. We packed up our gear, abandoned the foxholes we'd spent hours digging, and moved about a mile south, setting up a new defensive line in a different set of hedgerows. It was grueling work, digging in again in the heat, but nobody complained, not even Jenkins. We all knew what the alternative was. That night, as darkness fell, we were sitting in our new foxholes, eating cold sea rations. The air cooled down, bringing the inevitable evening mist. Around 2200 hours, the sky behind us lit up. A massive artillery barrage began landing on our old positions. The ground rumbled even from a mile away. We could see the flashes of the explosions reflecting off the low clouds, a relentless pounding that went on for 20 minutes. The sound was a continuous thunder. Eddie Beatrice was in the hole next to mine. He popped his head up, looking back toward the inferno. "Holy smokes," he whispered. "That's where we were. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten." We all knew it. If we hadn't moved, if I hadn't taken that shot at the harmless little plane, we'd be under that barrage right now. The precision of it was terrifying. They weren't just shelling an area. They were hammering the exact coordinates that Kid had marked. I sat there in the dark, listening to the distant thunder of the guns, rubbing my shoulder where the Garand had kicked me. I should have felt triumphant, I should have felt like a hero. I'd done my job, I'd saved my friends. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt drained. And strangely, I kept seeing the face of that young German pilot. I pictured him back at the MP stockade, probably in pain, scared, undergoing interrogation. I wondered where he was from. Maybe he grew up near a river too. Maybe he liked to hunt. He was just doing what he was told, flying his mission, drawing his maps, just like I was doing what I was told, sitting in a ditch and shooting at anything with a cross on it. He was good at his job. He'd found us. He'd almost killed us. And I was good at mine. I'd stopped him. That day changed something in me. Before that, the enemy was just a faceless force we were fighting. After that, I realized they were just guys. Smart guys, dangerous guys, terrified guys just like us. It didn't make me want to fight them any less. In fact, knowing how good they were made me fight harder, smarter, more carefully. But the blind hatred, the kind the propaganda movies tried to instill in us, that faded away for me in that field. War isn't about glory. It isn't like the movies with swelling music and clear-cut heroes and villains. It's dirty and scary, and it smells bad. It's about sitting in a hole in the ground praying you don't get blown up, and sometimes having to do terrible things to make sure the guy in the hole next to you gets to go home. I never saw that pilot again. I don't know his name. I don't know if he survived the war, but I've thought about him a lot over the last 70 years. I've thought about how thin the line is between being the guy holding the rifle and the guy bleeding against a stone wall. I didn't talk about this stuff for a long time when I got back home. People didn't want to hear the complicated parts. They wanted the simple stories of good versus evil. They didn't want to hear about the sick feeling in your gut when you realize you almost got your whole squad killed because you hesitated, or the strange empathy you feel for the kid you just shot down. So I kept it to myself. I went back to work, raised a family, tried to live a normal life. But those maps, those red crosses on the acetate, they stayed with me. They were a reminder of how fragile it all was. How luck and instinct and split-second decisions were the only difference between life and death. I'm an old man now. Most of the guys I served with are gone. Pop Miller made it through the war, but died of a heart attack in the 50s. Eddie Beatrice went back to Brooklyn and became a cop. He passed away 10 years ago. Even Jenkins is gone. I'm telling this story now because I think it's important to remember the reality of it. Not the polished version, but the messy, complicated truth. The truth about fear and instinct and the strange, shared humanity that exists even in the middle of the killing. That day in Normandy, I disobeyed an order. I shot a man, and I found a map that saved my life. It was just one day in a long, terrible war, but it was the day I really understood what we were doing over there. I can still close my eyes and see that Storch hanging in the blue sky, like a slow duck over the Illinois River bottoms. I can feel the trigger break, and I can see those tired blue eyes of the pilot looking up at me. The ground didn't just shake that night, it groaned. Sitting in that new trench, a mile away from where we'd been just hours before, I felt the vibrations traveling up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. It's a sound you never really get out of your head. The rhythmic, heavy thud of heavy artillery, like a giant slamming a fist onto a wooden table over and over again. Every time a shell hit our old position, I thought about the red crosses on that map. I thought about how, if I'd stayed quiet, I'd be nothing but a memory scattered in the Normandy mud right now. Pop Miller was sitting across from me, his face illuminated by the distant, flickering orange glow of the explosions. He was trying to light a cigarette, his hands shielded inside his jacket to hide the flame, but he was struggling. He looked up at me, his eyes tired and sunken. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the guns. "Hard not to," I said. "Hearing those shells land exactly where my foxhole was, it's a strange feeling, Pop, like watching your own funeral from a distance." He finally got the cigarette lit and took a long, shaky drag. "That's the war, Sully. It's a game of inches and seconds. You just happened to be the one who saw the inch moving before it hit us. Don't let it get in your head too deep." "You did what you had to do." I leaned my head back against the dirt wall of the trench. The soil here was different. Sandier, less clay. It didn't hold the shape as well as the bocage mud. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I drifted off, I was back in Illinois. I remembered a winter when I was 16. My father and I were out tracking a buck that had been raiding our corn cribs. It was a massive thing. A ghost, we called him, because he never seemed to be where the tracks said he should be. We'd been out for 3 days in the biting cold, our breath blooming in white clouds. My father told me, "Frank, a deer doesn't just run. He calculates. He knows where the wind is coming from, and he knows where the cover is. If you want to catch him, you have to stop thinking like a hunter and start thinking like the deer." "Sigh," I realized then that the German pilot was that ghost buck. He wasn't just flying, he was calculating. He was reading the wind and the cover, looking for us just like I'd looked for that deer. The only difference was that the deer didn't have a radio and a battery of 88s waiting for his signal. "Hey, Sully," Eddie Beatrice whispered from the next hole over. "You think they'll come for us now? I mean, now that they know we moved?" "They don't know we moved, Eddie," Jenkins chimed in, his voice dripping with his usual sarcasm. "That's the whole point of the shelling. They think they're turning us into Swiss cheese right now. They won't realize we're gone until they send an infantry probe forward to count the bodies and find nothing but empty holes. Which means tomorrow is going to be a long day," Pop Miller added, crushing his cigarette into the dirt. "Get some sleep, boys. If the Krauts realize their prize catch got away, they're going to be sore about it." I tried to follow his advice, but the adrenaline from the afternoon was replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The maps I'd found weren't just about us. I'd seen other markings on the edges of the photographs. There were notes about fuel depots, locations of our armored reserves, even the tentative path of the planned breakout toward Avranches. The Germans knew more than we thought they did. They were organized, meticulous, and they were watching everything from those spindly little planes. Morning came with a gray, dismal light. The artillery had stopped around Oro 300, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and something metallic, the scent of a landscape that had been chewed up and spat out by high explosives. I was heating some water for coffee over a small smokeless fire when a runner from battalion came jogging down the line. He looked like he'd been through a meat grinder, his uniform torn and his face splattered with mud. "Sergeant Sullivan?" he panted, looking around. "That's me," I said, standing up. "Captain Evans wants you at the CP. Now, bring your gear." I looked at Pop, who just shrugged. I grabbed my Garand and followed the runner back toward the barn. The mood at the command post was frantic. Maps were spread out across every available surface, and officers were hunched over them, arguing in low, urgent tones. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Captain Evans saw me and beckoned me over to a corner. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink. He was holding one of the maps I'd recovered, the one with the most detailed overlays. "Sullivan, sit down," he said. It wasn't a request. "We've been over these maps all night. The intelligence boys at Division are having a fit. This isn't just tactical reconnaissance. This is part of a much larger coordinated effort. But there's a problem." He pointed to a section of the map near the crash site. "This grid square here. There's a series of notations in a shorthand we haven't fully cracked yet. They seem to refer to a mobile radar unit or a forward observation post that we didn't even know existed. We think the pilot might have dropped something, a logbook, a secondary satchel, or maybe there's equipment in that wreckage we missed in the dark." I felt a knot tie itself in my stomach. "You want me to go back there, sir?" "The pilot mentioned something during his first round of questioning," Evans said, leaning in. "He was delirious from the pain meds, but he kept talking about the Black Book. He said it couldn't fall into American hands. We searched him. We searched the satchel you brought back. No Black Book. It has to be at the crash site." "Sir, the Germans are probably crawling all over that field by now," I said. "They know their plane went down. They'll be looking for that pilot and his gear." "I know," Evans said grimly. "That's why I'm sending you. You know the terrain. You know exactly where that plane hit. I'm giving you a 5-man patrol. Your mission is simple. Find that book. If the Germans are there, engage only if necessary, but get that intel back here. We think it contains the transmission frequencies for their entire sector net." I nodded. "In the Army, you don't argue with simple missions, even when you know they're anything but." I went back to the platoon and picked my team. I took Pop Miller because I needed his steady hand. I took Jenkins because despite his mouth, he was the best scout we had. I took Eddie Beatrice, mostly because I didn't want him out of my sight where he could get into trouble, and a quiet guy named Miller, no relation to Pop, who was a wizard with a bar. We moved out an hour later. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, but the air remained damp and chilly. We didn't use the roads. We stuck to the shadows of the hedgerows, moving in a staggered line, every sense on high alert. The closer we got to the old position, the more the landscape changed. It was unrecognizable. What had been a lush, green, sunken lane was now a series of jagged craters and splintered trees. The smell was the worst part, the smell of the earth's guts being torn open. We passed the spot where our foxholes had been. They were gone, replaced by a massive hole that could have swallowed a truck. "Look at that," Eddie whispered, his face pale. "We'd have been gone, Sully. Just poof." "Don't look at it," Pop snapped. "Keep your eyes on the tree line. We're in the gap now. Nobody owns this stretch of dirt right now. We reached the orchard near the crash site. The sweet smell of the apples was gone, replaced by the lingering stench of aviation fuel. We went prone, crawling through the tall grass toward the stone wall. I peered over the edge of the stones. The Storch was still there, a crumpled skeleton of wood and canvas. But something was different. There were fresh tracks in the mud, boot prints, lots of them. Germans, Jenkins whispered, pointing toward the far side of the plane. I saw them then, 3 of them, wearing the mottled camouflage smocks of the Waffen SS. They were systematically stripping the cockpit of the plane, throwing pieces of equipment into a pile. One of them was holding a small dark object, a book. My heart hammered against the ground. We were 20 yards away. If we moved, they'd see us. If we didn't, they'd walk away with the very thing we came for. I looked at Pop. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed to me, himself, and Miller with the bar. He signaled for us to take aim. Jenkins and Eddie were to cover the flanks. I sighted in on the German holding the book. He was older than the pilot, with a hard, angular face and a jagged scar across his chin. He looked like a man who had seen too much and enjoyed most of it. He tucked the book into his tunic and said something to the others, laughing. I felt that cold, Illinois hunter's focus settle over me again. I took a breath, let half of it out. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Now, Pop whispered. The bar opened up first, a stuttering thip, thip, thip that tore through the quiet of the orchard. My Garand joined in a split second later. The German with the book didn't even have time to scream. He went down hard, the force of the .30-06 rounds slamming him back against the fuselage. The other 2 dived for cover behind the engine block. "Suppressive fire!" Pop yelled. The field erupted into chaos. We were pouring lead into the wreckage, the bullets whining as they ricocheted off the metal frame. Return fire started coming from the trees beyond the wall, Mauser rounds cracking over our heads like whips. There weren't just 3 of them. There was a whole squad hidden in the woods. "They were waiting for us!" Jenkins shouted, ducking as a clump of dirt was kicked up by a bullet inches from his head. "Sully, get the book!" Pop roared over the noise. "We'll cover you! Go!" I didn't think. If I'd thought about it, I'd have stayed behind that wall. I leaped over the stones and sprinted across the open grass. The distance felt like 100 miles. Every muscle in my body was screaming, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. I could hear the whir of bullets passing my ears, the dull thud of rounds hitting the ground around my feet. I reached the German corporal. He was slumped against the wing, his eyes open and glassy. I didn't look at his face. I reached into his tunic and yanked out the black leather book. It was heavy, the cover slick with his blood. "Got it!" I screamed. I turned to run back, but a grenade landed 5 feet to my left. I saw it hit the mud, a German potato masher with its wooden handle. I didn't run. I dived. I hit the dirt behind the plane's tail section just as the blast went off. The world turned into a roar of white light and flying debris. Shrapnel shredded the canvas of the plane above me, and a cloud of stinging smoke filled my lungs. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear the gunfire anymore. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. I looked back toward the wall. Pop and the others were pouring fire into the tree line, creating a wall of lead that kept the Germans' heads down. I ran. I didn't care about the bullets anymore. I just ran for that stone wall like it was the gateway to heaven. I vaulted over the stones, landing in a heap on top of Eddie Beatrice. "You okay? You okay?" Eddie was shouting, shaking my shoulder. "I'm fine," I gasped, clutching the book to my chest. "Let's get the hell out of here." "Fall back! Fall back!" Pop ordered. We retreated through the orchard, moving in a leapfrog pattern. We'd run 20 yards, drop, fire a clip to keep them back, then run again. The Germans were pursuing us, but they were cautious. They didn't know how many of us there were, and our barman, Miller, was doing a hell of a job keeping them pinned. We made it back to the sunken lane, the dead zone, and vanished into the craters. We didn't stop running until we were back within sight of our new lines. When we finally slumped into the CP barn, we were covered in soot, blood, and mud. I walked up to Captain Evans and dropped the black book on his table. The blood had started to dry, making the leather tacky. Evans picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the first page, and his eyes widened. He looked at me, then at the book, then back at me. "Sullivan," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "You have no idea what you just did." "I hope it was worth it, sir," I said, leaning against a wooden pillar. My legs felt like jelly. "We almost left our skin in that field." "Worth it?" Evans whispered. "This isn't just frequencies. These are the locations of every V-weapon launch site in the Pas-de-Calais sector. They were using the spotter planes to calibrate the guidance systems. He looked around the room at his staff. "Get the radio. We need to jump this to London. High Command needs this yesterday." We were sent back to our platoon. That night, the sky didn't roar with German artillery. It roared with ours. And then, we heard the heavy, low drone of the Allied bombers, hundreds of them, heading east. They weren't hitting the front lines. They were hitting the spots listed in that black book. As I sat in my foxhole, watching the horizon light up with the distant flashes of the bombing run, I felt a strange sense of finality. The little Storch, the young pilot, the maps, the black book. It was all connected, a chain of events that started with one shot in a muddy ditch and ended with the destruction of the enemy's most secret weapons. Pop Miller sat down next to me, handing me a canteen of lukewarm water. "You did good, Frank. Real good." "I just wanted to save the squad, Pop," I said. "That's how it starts," he said, looking up at the bombers. "You save your friends, and sometimes you end up saving a whole lot more." I didn't feel like I'd saved the world. I just felt tired. I looked at my hands, still stained with the dirt of that orchard, and I wondered how many more days like this I had left in me. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The war went on, of course. Normandy was just the beginning. There were more hedgerows, more fields, more towns to take. But that day, the day of the spotter plane, remained the clearest in my mind. It was the day I realized that in war, knowledge is just as lethal as a bullet, and sometimes a map can be the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. I still have a small piece of the canvas from that Storch. I found it snagged on my uniform when I got back to the barn. It's a dirty, olive-drab scrap of fabric, nothing special to look at. But when I hold it, I can still smell the fuel and the apples. I can still hear the crack of the Garand and the roar of the bombs. And I remember that sometimes the things people laugh at, the harmless planes, the useless details, are the very things that decide who gets to go home and who stays behind in the mud. I went home, and every day since then, I've tried to make sure that the men who didn't, the ones whose names were marked with red crosses on a German map, aren't forgotten. That's why I'm telling you this, because the maps are gone and the planes are wrecks, but the stories are all we have left, and as long as someone is listening, those boys are still with us. I think about the pilot sometimes. I wonder if he ever knew that his black book changed the course of the summer of '44. I hope he didn't. I hope he just went to a camp, sat out the war, and went back to his own river bottom somewhere in Germany. Because at the end of the day, we were both just kids caught in a storm that was way bigger than both of us. The smoke from those bomber strikes didn't just drift away, it hung over the horizon like a shroud for 3 days. You could see it from our new positions, a dark, bruised smear against the morning light. We were moving again, pushing deeper into the heart of the bocage, and the victory felt hollow in that way only soldiers understand. We'd saved our skins, sure, but the war didn't stop to thank us. It just demanded more. I walked point for the first few miles. My eyes were bloodshot, and every time a bird took flight from a hedge, my thumb went straight to the safety of my Garand. That was the thing about the Storch. It had robbed me of the sky. I used to look up to find a bit of peace, a reminder that the world was bigger than the mud, but now the sky felt like a giant eye, cold and calculating, just waiting for me to step into the open. We reached a small crossroads village called Le Désert. It was a cluster of stone houses, most of them missing their roofs, with a church steeple that looked like a broken tooth. The air was thick with the smell of wet plaster and old soot. We were told to hold the crossroads while the rest of the battalion moved around our flank. Pop Miller signaled for us to take the cellar of a house on the corner. It was a sturdy-looking place, or it had been before a tank shell punched a hole through the second floor. We scrambled down into the damp darkness. It smelled of fermented apples and earth. "All right, settle in," Pop said, his voice raspy. "Sully, you and Eddie take the first watch by the cellar window. Jenkins, Miller, get some sleep. We're going to be here a while." I sat by the narrow horizontal window that looked out onto the street. The glass was gone, replaced by a jagged frame of wood. I rested the barrel of my rifle on a crate of dusty wine bottles. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a soft, persistent Normandy drizzle that turned everything into a blur of gray. Eddie sat next to me, hugging his knees. He looked smaller in the shadows. "Hey, Sully," he whispered. "You ever think about what that pilot is doing right now? You think he's eating? Or maybe he's already on a boat to a camp in the States." I looked at the rain. "I don't know, Eddie. I hope he's eating. I hope he's anywhere but here." I was thinking about my mom's kitchen. Eddie said, his voice trembling just a little. "She makes this brisket on Sundays. You can smell it from the bottom of the stairs. The whole house feels warm, you know? Not this kind of warm, like a fever, but real warmth. I'd give anything to just sit at that table and not have to listen for the wind." I knew that feeling. Back in Illinois, my mother used to bake bread in a cast-iron stove. On winter mornings, the kitchen was the only place in the world that mattered. The wood would crackle, and the dog would be curled up by the hearth, and for a few hours, you could forget that the harvest had been thin or that the tractor needed a part we couldn't afford. I learned how to be still in that kitchen. I'd sit in the corner, watching the shadows dance on the wall, learning how to wait. My father used to say that a man who can't sit still is a man who's already lost. He taught me that in the woods, too. He'd make me sit against a white oak for 4 hours without moving a muscle, just watching the squirrels and the wind. "The woods will tell you their secrets, Frank," he'd say, "but only if you're quiet enough to hear them." That training was the only reason I was still breathing. The Army tried to teach us situational awareness in 6 weeks of basic training, but you can't teach a man to hear the silence between the leaves in a classroom. You have to live it. You have to know what it feels like when the atmosphere changes right before a storm, or right before an ambush. The street outside was silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of water from a broken gutter. Then, I heard it, a metallic clink. It was faint, maybe 50 yards away, coming from around the corner of the church. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't the sound of a footstep, it was the sound of metal hitting stone. A helmet, maybe, or a shovel. "Eddie, stay back," I breathed, my hand tightening on the garand. I peered through the window. A shape emerged from the mist. It wasn't a squad of soldiers. It was a single man. He was wearing a tattered gray coat, and he was limping badly. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a white cloth tied to a stick. He stopped in the middle of the street, looking around with a terrified, hollow expression. He was a German, but he looked like a ghost. His uniform was shredded, and his face was a mask of dried blood and dirt. "Pop!" I called out softly. Pop Miller was on his feet in a second, his carbine ready. He looked over my shoulder. "Desertion? Or a trap?" "He's alone, Pop, and he's hurt bad," I said. The German started to collapse, his knees buckling. He caught himself on the corner of a stone well, the white flag fluttering feebly in the rain. He began to cry out, a low, melodic wailing that didn't sound like a soldier. It sounded like a child. "Help! Bitte! Help!" If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. "Don't go out there!" Jenkins hissed, waking up and seeing the scene. "It's a classic setup. Snipers in the church tower, waiting for us to play the Good Samaritan." "He doesn't have a weapon, Jenkins," Eddie said, his voice rising. "Look at him. He's dying." "So are a lot of people," Jenkins snapped. I looked at the man. He was leaning his forehead against the cold stone of the well, his shoulders heaving. He looked exactly like the pilot had looked against that wall, but without the leather jacket and the maps. He was just a human being who had reached the end of his rope. I thought about the maps again. The red crosses, the calculated death, and then I looked at this man, who was the physical manifestation of the aftermath of those calculations. If we were the targets on his map, he was the debris left over from ours. "I'm going out," I said. "Sullivan, stay in this cellar," Pop ordered, but there was no iron in his voice. He was looking at the man, too. "I'll be quick, Pop. Cover the windows." I didn't wait for a second order. I climbed out of the cellar entrance into the rain. The cold water hit my face, shocking me. I stayed low, moving along the walls of the houses, my rifle tucked into my shoulder. I scanned the church tower, the dark windows of the upper floors. Nothing moved. I reached the well. The German didn't even look up as I approached. He was mumbling to himself something about mutter and house. I put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched violently, his eyes snapping open. They were gray, clouded with pain and fever. He saw my uniform, the American flag on my shoulder, and he didn't try to fight. He just reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed my sleeve. "Please," he whispered in broken English. "No more. Please." I saw his leg then. It had been hit by shrapnel, probably days ago. It was swollen and black, the scent of gangrene cutting through the smell of the rain. He'd been wandering in the woods, dying slowly until he saw our light or heard our voices. I slung my rifle and put his arm over my shoulder. He was light, way too light for a grown man. It felt like I was carrying a bundle of dry sticks. I lugged him back toward the cellar, my boots slipping on the wet cobbles. "Open up!" I hissed as I reached the entrance. Eddie and Jenkins helped me pull him down into the darkness. We laid him on a pile of empty burlap sacks. Pop Miller moved in with a flashlight, shielding the beam with his hand. "God almighty," Pop whispered, seeing the leg. "He's a goner if we don't get a medic." "We are the medics for now," I said, reaching for my first aid kit. We did what we could. We cleaned the wound with canteen water and wrapped it in clean bandages. We gave him a sip of coffee and a piece of chocolate from a K ration. The man watched us with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder, as if we were creatures from another planet. He stayed with us for 4 hours. He told us his name was Carl. He was a baker from Munich. He'd been drafted 3 months ago. He hated the war. He hated the mud. He just wanted to go back to his ovens and the smell of warm rye bread. As the night wore on, his fever got worse. He started rambling in German, his voice rising and falling in the cramped cellar. We sat there in the dark, an American squad and a dying German baker listening to the rain. "You think he's going to make it, Sully?" Eddie asked. "I don't know, Eddie. Carl died just before dawn. He didn't go out with a bang or a struggle. He just took one long, shuddering breath and stopped. The silence that followed was the heaviest I'd ever felt. We buried him in the garden behind the house as the sun started to peek through the clouds. We didn't have a cross, so I took 2 pieces of wood from a shattered chair and tied them together with some twine. Jenkins didn't say anything snide. He just helped dig the hole. As we stood over the small mound of earth, Pop Miller took off his helmet. "He was just a baker," he said quietly. "Remember that. When you look at the maps, when you see the targets, remember there's a baker at the other end of the line." We left Le Désert an hour later, moving back to the main body of the division. The encounter with Carl stayed with me, a heavy weight in my chest. It made the Black Book feel different. It made the victory over the V-weapon sites feel different. It wasn't just about destroying machines. It was about ending the lives of thousands of Carls and thousands of guys like me. The war didn't care about bakers. It didn't care about farmers from Illinois. It only cared about the red crosses on the maps. We marched for 3 days, heading toward the heights of Hill 192. The Germans were dug in deep there, and we knew it was going to be a bloodbath. The hedgerows were thicker here, the terrain steeper. Every yard was a battle. I was promoted to sergeant after the mission with the book. Captain Evans personally pinned the stripes on my sleeve. "You're a leader now, Sullivan," he told me. "Your men look to you. Keep your head on straight." I didn't feel like a leader. I felt like a man who was getting better and better at a job he never wanted. I was learning how to read the terrain like a predator. I could tell which bushes were likely to hide a machine gun nest by the way the light hit them. I could smell a German patrol before I saw them, the scent of their ersatz tobacco and the grease they used on their rifles. One afternoon, we were pinned down in a narrow draw. A German sniper was somewhere in a stand of pines above us, and he was good. He'd already clipped 2 guys from B Company. We were huddled against the muddy bank, the bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets. "Sully, we can't stay here," Pop said, hugging the dirt. "He's going to start picking us off one by one." I looked up at the pines. The sun was behind the trees, making it hard to see anything but silhouettes. I thought about the Storch again, the way I'd led the shot. "I see a glint," I whispered. "Near that crooked branch on the left." I didn't have a sniper scope. I just had my Garand and the eyes my father gave me. I adjusted my position, feeling the mud seep into my trousers. I waited for the glint again. There, a tiny flash of glass, a scope lens. I didn't aim at the glint. I aimed 6 inches to the right, where the man's head would be if he was leaning into the rifle. I felt the familiar weight of the trigger, the tension in my shoulder. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I fired. The recoil was a sharp, clean punch. A second later, a dark shape tumbled from the tree, crashing through the branches like a heavy fruit. The firing from the pines stopped. "Nice shot, Sarge," Eddie said, his eyes wide. "Let's move," I said, my voice flat, "before his friends find us." We pushed up the hill, the adrenaline masking the exhaustion. By the time we reached the summit, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows over the valley below. We were tired, we were hungry, and we were covered in the dust of a dozen different fields. But we were alive. That night, as I sat in a shallow scrape on the hillside, looking out over the dark expanse of France, I thought about the maps again. I realized that I wasn't just a mark on someone else's map anymore. I was the one drawing the lines. Every shot I took, every decision I made, it was redrawing the world. It was a terrifying responsibility. I pulled out the piece of canvas from the Storch that I still kept in my pocket. It was frayed and dirty, but it felt like a talisman. It reminded me that even in the middle of this madness, an individual could make a difference. One shot could save a squad, one book could stop a bombardment, one act of kindness to a baker could save a soul. The war was a machine, yes, but it was a machine made of men. And as long as we remembered that, as long as we saw the faces behind the targets, maybe we could come out the other side with something left of ourselves. I looked at Eddie, who was fast asleep, his head resting on his pack. I looked at Pop, who was staring into the distance with that weary, eternal scowl. I knew that tomorrow would bring more hills, more hedgerows, more decisions. But for tonight, the sky was clear. The stars were out, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't look like eyes. They just looked like stars. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the heights wash over me. I dreamt of Illinois. I dreamt of the cornfields swaying in the wind, the sound like 1,000 whispers. I dreamt of the smell of warm bread and the crackle of a wood fire. And in my dream, there were no maps, there were no red crosses. There was just the open road and the sun on my back and a world that didn't need to be saved. I woke up to the sound of a distant whistle. It wasn't a bird, it was an incoming shell. The war was back, and I had a job to do. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I rolled out of my scrape, the mud sticking to my face. "Incoming!" I roared. "Heads down! Get to cover!" The world exploded in a fountain of dirt and fire. The barrage was heavy and it was accurate. They'd found us again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I knew how to play the game. I knew how to read the inches. I grabbed my rifle and looked toward the horizon, waiting for the first sign of the infantry advance. I was Frank Sullivan. I was a sergeant in the United States Army, and I wasn't going to let them mark me out. Not today, not ever. The battle for Hill 192 lasted for hours. It was a chaotic, swirling mess of fire and smoke. We fought from hole to hole, from tree to tree. I lost track of time. I lost track of everything, but the next clip of ammo and the next target. When the smoke finally cleared, we were still on the hill. The Germans had been pushed back. We'd held the line. I sat on a stump, my hands shaking as I tried to light a cigarette. My uniform was shredded, and I had a shallow graze on my arm that I didn't even remember getting. Pop Miller walked over and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything. He just handed me his canteen. I took a long drink, the water tasting like nectar. "We made it, Sully," he said quietly. "Yeah, Pop, we made it." We looked out over the valley. The sun was coming up, a pale golden light that touched the tops of the trees. It was beautiful, in a way that made my heart ache. "You know," Pop said, looking at the sunrise, "I think I'm going to go back to school when this is over. Maybe study history. I want to see if I can figure out why we keep doing this to each other. I think I'll just go back to the farm," I said. "I've had enough history to last me a lifetime." We sat there for a long time, watching the light grow. The war was still going on, somewhere over the next ridge, but for this moment, in this place, there was peace, and that was enough. It had to be enough. As I look back on it now, all those years later, I realized that the most important thing I learned in the war wasn't how to shoot a rifle or read a map. It was how to cherish the quiet moments, the moments between the shells, the moments when you can just breathe and watch the sun come up, because those are the moments that make the rest of it bearable. Those are the moments that remind us why we fight in the first place. Not for the maps, not for the flags, but for the chance to go home and see the people we love. I'm glad I'm still here to tell you this. I'm glad those memories didn't die in the mud of Normandy. And I'm glad that somewhere out there, there's a kid from Illinois who's looking at the stars and dreaming of a world without crosses. That's what it was all for, I think. That's what it was all for.